I think we have no more questions except this one, which I'm going to break my own rule of only asking one part question at a time and ask you a double jointed question. In my opinion, in the history of the United States, there's never been a more pervasive set of liars than the Trump administration. And I want you to address that, particularly in framing it with the big lie about the stolen election. But I'd like you to go back to one thing we haven't talked about that was a significant chapter in your book. And that was the one big lie with the fake documents from Sisson.
Right. So here's the story about the documents, and then I'll come to the Trump, but we'll make that the denouement here. They sent a guy named Edgar Sisson, who had no foreign experience and had been a muckraking journalist and editor. They sent him to Russia because they were very concerned that the Russians would get out of the war. On his way over, the Bolshevik Revolution took place. So by the time he arrived, the city was pretty much closed down and the Bolsheviks were in charge. His goal was to provide propaganda that would get the Russian people to stay in the war, which, by the way, was a stupid idea because it wasn't going to happen. The Russian people were sick of being in the war. The Bolsheviks had argued prior to taking power that they wanted to take the United States, or they want to take Russia out of this capitalist war. They want to make a separate peace. A separate peace was a big problem because Wilson didn't want a separate peace, and neither did the Allies. They wanted to really decimate the Central Powers. So anyway, while Sisson is there and he doesn't know what the hell he's doing and stirring up lots of trouble, trying to get the ambassador fired and other crazy things, some white Russians come to him with documents they claim show that the Bolsheviks are really just agents of the Germans, and they're going to take the Russia out of the war because they're just doing what the Germans want them to do because the Germans have funded them. So this has all the elements of what makes disinformation work. First of all, it's partly credible. The Germans had allowed Lenin to take the so-called sealed train. It wasn't really sealed, take the sealed train through Germany to get to Russia. And there were lots of rumors about the fact that the Germans were giving them money in hopes they would win the revolution. So Sisson, thinking he had this great muckraking scoop, takes these documents. There was almost 70 of them, which were utterly bogus. I mean, they had statements in them like instructions from the German government on whether Lenin should be elected in charge of the Communist Party in Russia, and all kinds of stuff like that. And he's very excited about this, and he comes back to the United States with these documents, and he wants them to be true, which of course is another element of disinformation, right? You really want something to be true so much it matches what you think might be true, so therefore you like it more than something that would argue against what you want to be true. And he gives them to Creel and the State Department. And for some reason, and we don't know why, this was at the end of the spring, he arrived in Washington. The pieces were not, the stories were not released. This was a very big thing for Sisson because he was determined to get these out. Kept working on them. And the State Department probably didn't want to do it not because they were sure they were bogus, because actually there were a lot of people in the State Department that thought they were true. But more than that, because they may have actually been looking for the right moment to put them out when they thought it could help tip the scales against the Allies, against the Germans as being perfidious. It may have been because they just forgot about it for a while and they didn't know quite what to do about it. It may have been because they were waiting for some more documents, but they didn't do anything with it. And so in mid-September, and we don't know how this happened either, Creel convinced Wilson to release the documents. And this decision, and the documents were sent out on a Friday. It was a 6-part series that started on Sunday and sent out to newspapers. The State Department wasn't informed that this had happened until Saturday, and they were very disturbed because they had a few diplomats left in Russia and they didn't want them to be harmed, which was a real possibility because these documents were very incendiary. And Secretary of State Lansing tried to stop the documents, but it was too late. They're already out. And Wilson didn't even talk to Lansing about it. which tells you something about his relationship with Lansing. What makes this, the fact these documents are bogus, which we now know, but we weren't certain of it until 30 years later, but now it was established conclusively by George Kennan in the 1950s. But we know that the documents, we've known for some time the documents were bogus, but what never has been written about is the extent to which the American press published these. Papers like the New York Times published them verbatim. They published exactly what the CPI set out on the front page. Many papers published every day. I had a graduate student go and look at 100 papers, a selection of 100 papers. We could not find one newspaper that wrote one editorial against calling into question the documents. I do know of one, it just didn't happen to be in that sample, and it was a New York Evening Post. And it did call them into question, and Creel went crazy. And of course some leftist publications did, and he didn't like that either. Then he decided, just because of that one paper, that he would bring in academics to study the papers. And the academics said they thought the documents were real, but they didn't think it showed that the Bolsheviks were German spies, that the Bolsheviks were doing what they were going to do because they had their own agenda, and that was their agenda. And but when Creel came in and said, you can't say that, they didn't say it. And one of a very famous Russian scholar said, we know we were under a lot of pressure from the government to be patriotic. And at a time like that, you just can't, you can't say everything you know. And so as a result, those documents became cemented into the public psyche at a time when the Red Scare was beginning to take place. And so now it wasn't just German spies, it was German Bolshevik spies, all of whom were in the United States, trying to subvert the United States. And it became a very important document in fueling the Red Scare of the 1918, 1919. It's a disgraceful episode, very revealing about the kind of things that happen today, of course. And it fits the narratives that we see with what happens with the Trump administration. And that is, the idea that you tell people things they think might be true and they would like to believe, even though there's no proof of it at all. And that's a tremendous power the president has, the ability to use the office and the trappings of the office for venal purposes. And of course, it's venal when Lyndon Johnson lies about the Tonkin Gulf, the assault on the Maddox and the Tonkin Gulf, and doesn't put out, inflates what the occurrence to try to get us in the Vietnam War. Those things are terrible. But in the case of Trump administration, presidential lying is a bipartisan activity. But in the Trump administration, it reached a new level because usually, when you lie and you're caught, you're embarrassed. Trump administration, you just keep on lying, saying the same lies over again, which is pretty stunning.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up with one last question, and that is there anything we can do about it?
Yeah, I think there is, but I won't say it's easy. One of the reasons that we don't have good laws is because members of Congress, if they're in power, members of Congress are part of the president's party. They don't want to go after the president for abusing the privileges of the propaganda privileges of the office. And if you're not in power, nobody's going to do anything because you're not in power. But what we really need to do is investigate what our government does. We need to have stronger rules. We don't even have good rules about what a president can do and what they can't do. Our definition of propaganda in the rule books, in the law, is the propaganda is when the government hires somebody who pretends to be a journalist to write about a government agency. Well, that's not a good thing to do, but that's a very limited idea of what propaganda is. And so there are things we could do. We could actually, I know everybody always says these things, but I believe it's true. We could set up a blue ribbon panel to find out exactly, to do a study to find out exactly what the government's doing. We don't even know how much government information is put out every year. We don't even have a sense of this because a lot of it's taken for granted and a lot of it's done in ways we can't see. We need to find out, for one thing, what's happening. And then we need to find out ways to monitor it on a regular basis and call it out. And journalists have unfortunately, I think, missed an important part of the story. Journalists get angry because their FOI request isn't answered. I mean, that's what they want to go after the FOI process. Why don't I get more of my specific requests answered? But I think what journalists ought to do is ask the question, what is the government doing with our tax dollars to influence what we think? It's not an easy thing to do. In some ways, not even sexy, because some of the things the government does do are very valuable to us. I mean, there's a paradox here. One of the great jewels of our democracy is the amount of really high quality information the government puts out. Scientific studies, alerts on pending hurricanes, publishing the proceedings of Congress, publishing the proceedings and opinions and proceedings in the State Department. And we put out lots and lots of wonderful data and information. And that's good. We ought to recognize that. But there are examples I can go through, though I won't right now. But there are cases where presidents use the power of their office to promote a president can get up and give a speech and say, I think we should lower the minimum wage, raise the minimum wage. That's fine. It's not fine for the Labor Department to put out information trying to urge Americans to lobby Congress to raise the minimum wage. Labor Department shouldn't do that. Presidents can argue for it, but we shouldn't use the apparatus of the government to try to propagandize our citizens to tell Congress to do something. I happen to think the minimum wage should be raised, but I'm, as a journalist, that's not my job. My job is to report what's going on. And we need to cover more of these transgressions. We need to make people think about what the government's doing that's undemocratic. And maybe Trump, he's obviously an outlier in many ways, but maybe he tells us to think about that. You know, when he says he won the election, he's sitting in the White House, a very dignified place. And what does he have play in the background? Hail to the chief. Biden can't play Hail to the Chief in the background when he's not elected, but Trump can. And he can put his name on coronavirus checks. And those are flagrant examples. And so that should give us cause to ask ourselves what's okay and what's not. And there are laws we could write, and they should be enforced.
It's a great note to end on. Here it is, Manipulating the Masses, Woodrow Wilson and the Birth of American Propaganda by Dr. John Maxwell Hamilton, the winner, I forgot to mention, of the 2021 Goldsmith Prize from the Shorenstein Institute on Media and Politics, etc., at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. And this is published by the LSU Press, and there's a link to the book on our chat right now if you'd like to look at it. Doctor, thank you again. It was really an informative, fascinating evening. And I did also love your sentence. Propaganda reverses the democracy idea that appointed officials answer to the people, rather than it means people answer to the government.
Thank you for having me on, Allan. Thanks for the
Thanks, it was great.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and we'll see you soon. Look for at the OPC bulletin for the next program. Thanks a million.